After being devastated by his father's suicide, a teenage boy enters into a tumultuous relationship with a French dominatrix that soon turns dangerous. Welcome back to Nonstop Recap. Today we'll be recapping the 2014 erotic drama, My Mistress. The film opens on Charlie, a troubled 16-year-old boy, as he smokes and jumps on the hood of a car. He begins biking back to his house when he passes by Maggie, a French woman who has just moved to town and is arguing with her movers. Charlie finally makes it home and hears loud music blaring out from the garage. He struggles to get into the garage, but once he makes it in and turns on the lights, he's horrified by what he sees. His father Tom has hung and killed himself, and Charlie holds his body while calling for help. He eventually goes into the house and sees that his mom is throwing a party. She sees something is wrong with him and goes to talk to him about it. The film then cuts to Charlie and his mother Kate at his dad's funeral. After the service, Charlie goes looking for his mom and finds her kissing his dad's best friend, meaning the two have been having an affair. Furious, Charlie walks outside and begins slashing at a bush. Back at the house, things are tense between Charlie and Kate. She tries to give him some dinner, but he pushes it off the table. The next day, Charlie goes into the garage and Kate walks in. She tells him that they didn't find a note, and he asks her what she thinks Tom was thinking as he dies. Then he confronts her about her affair, and she slaps him. Charlie says he's declaring the garage a crime scene and yells at his mom not to touch anything. He then gets some spray paint and writes "crime scene" on the garage door. Charlie goes to a children's playground to smoke, and he spots Maggie there with her son. He offers her a cigarette and sits with her. He sees a pentagram tattooed on her wrist and asks if she's a witch that casts spells on people. Maggie says no, but Charlie tells her that he wishes someone would cast a spell on him to help him sleep. Maggie then tells him all he needs to sleep is a glass of whiskey and an incantation. When Charlie goes home that night, he pours himself a glass of whiskey before chanting, "I surrender my body into the abyss." He's able to sleep that night, and the next day he bikes over to Maggie's house. Her gate is a little busted, so he has to force his way through, but eventually Charlie makes it up to the house. No one answers the front door, so he comes in through the back and ends up walking in on Maggie in a black wig and latex suit working as a dominatrix with one of her clients. Maggie yells at Charlie when she sees him and chases him as he runs out of the house. He's able to get away and hides in her yard. Assuming Charlie's left, Maggie leaves her house sometime later and heads to a milk bar to put up an ad for a gardener. And Charlie secretly follows her and gets her number from it. He shows up the next day to inquire about the gardening ad, but the gate won't open. Maggie comes to let him in, only to yell when she sees it's Charlie. She tells him to leave, but he asks her to let him fix the gate and try him out for a few hours. He asks if he can get his bike from the back, and Maggie says yes. She goes into the house, and when she comes out, she sees that Charlie is gardening and fixing the gate for her. She asks him how old he is, and Charlie says that he's old enough. Eventually, he convinces her to hire him, and she says that he's hired, but tells him he's never allowed back in the house. When Charlie arrives at Maggie's house the next day, he sees her kissing her safety officer Leon as he leaves. We see Charlie pleasuring himself in the shower while thinking about Maggie. As Charlie spends more time working at the house, he lets his curiosity and lust get the better of him and peers in through the window and sees Maggie kissing Leon again. Maggie invites Charlie into the house and tells him not to look through the windows again. Charlie asks Maggie about why her clients come to see her and says they do it to forget their private pain. Charlie asks Maggie about her background and learns that she used to be a school teacher before becoming a dominatrix. Some time passes and eventually it's Christmas time. Maggie gets a present for her son, who she doesn't have custody of, and brings it to him at a park. It turns out to be a toy gun, and the social worker that's there to determine if Maggie is eligible for custody isn't impressed with this. Maggie ends up having to take the toy away from her son as he cries, and Leon shows up and tells her that he'll put in a good word for her with the social worker. Back at Charlie's home, he finds his mother in his father's office and freaks out on her, telling her that it's a crime scene and she can't touch any of it. She confronts him over blaming her for his father's death, and the two fight. Charlie heads to Maggie's house afterward, but she isn't home. He hops the gate and goes inside the house, where he goes through some of her things. When Maggie gets home, she sees Charlie's shoes and searches through the house for him. She eventually finds Charlie in her red room, and he's handcuffed himself to a carousel horse and is holding the key in his mouth. She screams at him to give her the key, and he tells her to make him. She eventually relents and gets a crop, repeatedly hitting him until he presumably spits it out. We cut forward to Charlie back at his house, and his mom asks him what the marks on his shoulders are, and he says that he fell off his bike. Charlie storms into his room and goes through his nighttime chanting, except this time he takes a shirt from Maggie that he stole and puts it on his face. Charlie goes back to Maggie the next day and tells her that he wants to be around her all the time because she's amazing, and she tells him she isn't who he thinks she is. Charlie insists on sticking around, but Maggie yells at him to leave before walking off. Charlie floats in Maggie's pool until she eventually changes her mind and comes back out, this time with tea. She offers him some sugar for his tea and hits him with her crop when he doesn't say thank you. Charlie gets home later that night and is almost hit when his mom backs the car out of the garage. The two get into another fight when Kate asks Charlie where he got his marks from, and Charlie storms off back to Maggie's house. He swims naked in her pool, and Leon sees him after having slept with Maggie. Charlie starts biking back to his house when Leon pulls up beside him and tells him that Maggie doesn't want to see him anymore. Charlie doesn't believe him and says he'd rather hear it from Maggie. Charlie asks Maggie about it the next day, and she warns him to stay away from Leon. Maggie then brings him into her red room and makes him get into a coffin. She closes the lid, and Charlie watches through a hole in the coffin as she deals with another client who likes to dress up like a dog and be humiliated. Afterward, Charlie and Maggie talk by the pool for a bit before taking Maggie's car and going for a drive to the playground. Charlie ends up asking Maggie if she can speak to the dead, and she tells him to just start talking because the dead are all around. He opens up to her about the death of his father, and he tells her he thinks it was his fault. She comforts him and encourages him to speak to his dad, promising that his dad will make a sign to talk back. When they get back to Maggie's house, Charlie says he's going to get back to work, but Maggie asks him to stay with her. They end up back in the red room, and Charlie helps Maggie undress. The film then cuts to Maggie in the social worker's office, where she learns that she's going to be getting custody back of her son soon. Charlie meets with Maggie, and the two go back to the playground to talk more. Maggie opens up about how she used to have a drug problem, which led to her son being injured. Looking to cheer Maggie up, he brings her to an arcade, and the two have fun playing games together. Charlie sneaks Maggie into his room that night, and the two drink a bit. Charlie says he's going to change into something more comfortable, but is clearly trying to grab something sneaky from his closet. Maggie questions him and laughs when she sees he was grabbing a condom. Maggie laughs as she says she isn't going to sleep with him. They end up lying together and talking more about Charlie's father. The film cuts to the next day as Charlie begins biking toward Maggie's house, and his mom gets ready to follow him. However, she gets interrupted when the man she was having an affair with shows up and tries to talk to her. She blows him off and is able to follow Charlie. At Maggie's house, Charlie is getting whipped by Maggie, but it gets to be too much and he tries to use his safe word. But Maggie keeps whipping him for a bit before snapping out of it. Disgusted with herself, she goes down into her foyer and cries. Kate sees Charlie leaving Maggie's house and goes up to the gate. She calls the gate, and when Maggie answers, she threatens Maggie to leave Charlie alone because he's only 16, and if she doesn't, then Kate is going to ruin Maggie's life. The next time Charlie shows up at Maggie's house, she yells at him to go away. Charlie is furious and ends up throwing furniture and a grill into her pool while cursing her. Eventually, Maggie comes down and brings Charlie back into the house, where she tells him that they're going to sleep together once, and then Charlie will leave and never come back. The two sleep together, and we watch as Leon pulls up to the house. When he comes in, he finds Maggie and Charlie on the couch after having slept together. He starts a fight with Maggie when she ends her affair with him and puts his hands on her, causing Charlie to step in. Maggie ends up kicking both of them out of the house. Sometime later, we see Charlie laying on his couch while his mom has a therapist ask him questions about Maggie. His mom later tells him to take anything he needs from the house because she's kicking him out. She says she can't live with someone who hates her, but she promises that she'll be there if he ever comes back. That night, Charlie breaks down and cries while his mother holds him. Charlie ends up going back to Maggie's house only to see that the house is mainly empty. He finds the room meant for Maggie's son and falls asleep in that bed. Maggie finds him in the morning and tells him that she's leaving. She was just coming back to grab a few things. The two say their final goodbyes, and Charlie heads back to his mom. He looks through his dad's clothes and asks to keep one of his jackets jackets for when he gets older. The film then cuts forward sometime, and we see Charlie out jogging with a group. They pass by the children's playground, and Charlie stops and stares at the playground while reminiscing on Maggie before running to catch up with his group. Click one of the videos on screen for more.